In this week's Star Wars Unlimited video, we're going to be diving back into the rules one more time, and this time going over what I think is one of the most complicated sections of the rules for new players, which is nested abilities and nested actions. I've had a lot of questions about what these are, how they work, how to resolve them, so I figured we'd do hopefully a fairly brief video to dive in and give you kind of the full breakdown so you can spot nested abilities and nested actions, understand what they are, how they work, and in most of your games now, you will be able to resolve the most complicated interactions that come up. So without any further ado, let's jump right into it. What's up everyone, it's Dan with Main Deck, and like I said, this week we're back with another Star Wars Unlimited rules video talking about nested abilities and nested actions, and the goal is here to give you all of the information you need so you'll be able to spot these and resolve them whenever they come up in your games, and leave you with hopefully very few questions about what happens. But as usual, if you do have questions or you need things explained in another way, there's no shame in that. Just go ahead and leave a comment down below. I'm happy to reword things. I'm happy to answer more specific interactions. Let me know what you need answered down in the comments below, and I will get to them as soon as I'm able to and provide you with comp rules references when appropriate. All right, now to kick things off, just to make sure our terms are totally clear here, we're going to talk about what abilities and actions are. The first thing to know is that an ability is any bit of card text basically that gives you special rules that you need to perform in order to perform that card or perform that effect. Abilities are the stuff written on the cards, basically. Actions, on the other hand, are those things you choose to use during your action phase. So when it's your turn in action phase, you can choose to play a card, perform an attack, pass, that kind of stuff. Those are going to be the actions. And in particular, when we're talking about nested actions a little later on, we're really most often going to be looking at play and attack. Those are kind of the main ones that are going to come up, but we're going to put a pin in those right now. I just want to make sure everyone understands there is a difference between abilities and actions. Abilities can even be things that happen outside of your action phase, like triggered abilities. Look at Boba Fett, leader, who has an ability that often can happen on the opponent's action phase when they have a unit that leaves play for some reason. Boba Fett is free to trigger. So the key to remember here is that abilities can kind of crop up at any time. Normally, actions are just used during your action phase, but we will go ahead and take a look at some effects in a little bit that are going to just be a little more nuanced than just choosing to take an action, choosing to play a card from your hand. Now, with those basic definitions out of the way, let's talk about abilities and specifically triggered abilities, because triggered abilities are these things that are going to typically happen outside of your regular action phase, or just, I mean, they can happen anytime, really. And these triggered abilities are really the heart of what creates what we call nested abilities and nested actions. So triggered abilities are always going to have some sort of trigger timing listed on them. They're these abilities like the when played effect, when defeated, on attack. These are all examples of triggered abilities, and usually when you're resolving these cards, you don't even think about it. You just kind of do what they say. You play the Luke Skywalker, you use the when played ability. When your Yoda dies, you use the when defeated ability. You don't normally think about it too much, but these are where the timing starts to get a little more confusing, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But there's a couple important things to understand about how triggered abilities work. The first thing is that triggered abilities always have to be resolved unless they say you may on them. A great example is the Boba Fett leader card, which says you may right on it. So when an enemy unit leaves play, you may ready a resource. And when a triggered ability doesn't say you may, like Ezra Bridger's doesn't, you have to use that ability when it comes up. Now, you're free to make any choices that you need to. For example, Ezra will let you choose what you want to do with the card, or Lando will let you choose up to 2 resources to return, so you do not have to return those resources if you want to. You can just choose 0 as your number, but you have to resolve it completely when possible, at least to the best of your ability. Now, an important thing to understand about triggered abilities is that the triggered abilities don't always happen immediately. That said, they are meant to happen as soon as possible. So the key to this is understanding that while you were resolving another ability, you are not able to stop, like mid-sentence, stop resolving that ability so that you can resolve another ability. If something would trigger while you're in the middle of resolving another ability, that triggered ability will be resolved as soon as possible. It'll happen at the next possible timing, which is usually going to be as soon as you've finished that ability. But really, when we get into that idea, that is the heart of nested abilities and nested actions. So we will talk about that more in depth very, very soon in this video. I need to mention one more thing about triggered abilities that I do think really needs to be understood to really tell the difference between nested abilities and nested actions and other types of situations involving triggered abilities, and that is simultaneous triggers. So we did go over simultaneous triggers in a previous rules video, and if you missed that, there's a card up here. You go ahead and click that, and we have a section of the video that goes over how simultaneous triggers work. But just to refresh you all, there are some cases in the game where the same game action will cause multiple triggers to happen. We used the example in that video of using Super Laser Blast and then having a bunch of on-defeat triggers in play. That one event, which is playing the Super Laser Blast, caused a bunch of units to be defeated, and thus all of their on-defeat triggers happened at the exact same time. Another great example would be playing a unit with a when played ability using Energy Conversion Lab to give it ambush. When you do something like that, now that unit has both an ambush, which is a when played ability, and their own printed when played ability. But going one step deeper, cards like Darth Vader Commanding the Legion actually already have two triggers at the exact same time printed right on the card. Darth Vader has both ambush and his own when played ability. Now, whenever you have a situation with multiple triggered abilities that have the exact same timing, those are called simultaneous triggers, and when that happens, we have a method already of deciding how we resolve how those happen. Again, that was covered in that last rules video, but just for a brief refresher, if you are the controller of multiple when played abilities, for example, you play Darth Vader Commanding the Legion, you now get to choose which of those abilities resolve first. Those two abilities have the exact same timing, and you just have to pick, do you want to resolve this one first, or do you want to resolve this one first? You can freely choose whichever one you want to resolve first, and then as soon as you're finished resolving that, you'll move on and resolve the other one. Pretty straightforward that way. When multiple players have simultaneous triggered abilities, though, it gets a little more complicated because the person whose turn it is, the player whose turn it is, who's taking the current action, is going to choose a player, and that player will resolve all of their abilities. Then they'll choose the next player who will resolve all of their abilities in the order of their choice. So that's basically how that works, but I wanted to make sure that was really clear because when we move on to the next step, we're going to be talking about nested abilities and nested actions, and we're going to be differentiating those from these simultaneous triggers that happen at the exact same trigger point, basically. So let's jump in, and first we'll talk about what nesting even means. So what is nesting, and what does nesting even mean? I'm going to go ahead and reference a fairly common enough reference, the Russian stacking dolls here. This is a set of basically nested dolls. There are smaller dolls resting within larger ones, and they just nest up and up and up until you have the largest doll. You open it up and you're going to find a smaller doll inside. That is the exact idea of what we're talking about here. Basically, with nested abilities and nested actions, we have abilities that are happening within other abilities and full actions that will happen within other abilities. In other words, you'll have situations where a triggered ability comes up in the middle of resolving another ability, and that may cause confusing timing based on what other abilities might already be waiting to resolve. So the concept of nested abilities and nested actions is looking specifically at when you're in the middle of resolving something else, a new trigger or a new ability or a new action has to happen. And the game just is giving us a set of rules and a set of ways to understand exactly how to cleanly resolve those so there are no questions about what happens each time. Now I'm going to start with the simpler of the two and talk about nested abilities first. Nested abilities are pretty straightforward a lot of the time. They're simply abilities that will trigger as the result of resolving another ability. And a lot of the time you won't even notice what's happening. They aren't going to be something complicated to resolve, but where nested abilities start to become important is when we have multiple abilities already pending to resolve, and then a new ability would trigger. So let me give you a really clear example of this. In this example, we're going to be playing a Death Trooper, but instead of just straight playing the Death Trooper, we're going to be using Energy Conversion Lab in order to play the Death Trooper. That is going to give the Death Trooper ambush, and thus that Death Trooper will have two when played abilities. The two when played abilities are the ambush ability and the ability on the Death Trooper, which says it can deal 2 damage to an enemy unit and then 2 damage to a friendly unit. As I mentioned before, when you have two abilities happening with the exact same timing, think of those at the same level, and you're just going to choose, do you want to resolve this ability first, or do you want to resolve this ability first? In the case of the Death Trooper, we could choose either one. We could resolve the ambush first, or we could resolve the 2 damage ability first. Totally your choice. But for our example, let's say we are going to choose to resolve the 2 damage ability before we resolve the ambush ability. So we will begin resolving the Death Trooper's when played ability to deal 2 damage. It'll deal 2 damage to itself, and then it'll also deal 2 damage to an enemy Greedo. Now, this is where things start to get interesting, because that 2 damage to that enemy Greedo obviously will defeat it and then cause that Greedo's on defeat ability to trigger. Now, this on defeat ability is going to be our first example of a nested ability. That nested ability is happening within the resolution of the Death Trooper's ability, and it happens while we have something else waiting to resolve, which is that ambush from the ECL that we haven't yet used on the Death Trooper. Now, you can imagine in a situation like this, it could be a little confusing. If we didn't have these clean rules about what to do, I would imagine a lot of people would be debating what to happen here. Maybe we do the ambush first because we had that ready to go. It came first. It should happen first, right? Or maybe we should resolve the Greedo first because it just happened. It's the most recent thing. We have to resolve that. He just died. He can't wait. He can't wait to shoot his shot. He's sitting there on the cantina floor. But this is exactly what the nested abilities and nested action rules are for. So what the nested abilities and nested action rules say is that whenever we have a nested ability or nested action, we are going to put everything else on hold, and we are going to resolve that nested ability or nested action first. So in this case, the clear answer is that we are going to resolve the Greedo trigger because it is a nested ability that is going to put everything else on hold and start resolving immediately. Now, the Greedo player is actually going to have some interesting choices here. If the Death Trooper player had dealt the 2 damage to the Death Trooper itself, the Greedo player, if assuming they reveal a non-unit card with Greedo's ability, will have the option to deal 2 more damage to that Death Trooper. Since the Greedo's ability is resolving first, and that Death Trooper has a pending ambush ability that hasn't yet happened, but had to be put on hold to resolve this nested Greedo ability, that Death Trooper might actually be defeated before that ambush can resolve. And then when the player goes to use that ambush, there is no longer a unit in play to ambush with, so the ambush is effectively lost in this situation. The Greedo player may also choose to send that 2 damage to a different ground unit. If they send that 2 damage at, for example, a Vanguard infantry controlled by the Death Trooper player, that has the ability to trigger another nested ability. By defeating the Vanguard infantry, now the Death Trooper player has to resolve the nested ability of the Vanguard infantry with that pending ambush on the Death Trooper still sitting there waiting to be used. And when they resolve that Vanguard infantry ability, they might choose to put that experience counter onto the Death Trooper to power up its ambush when it finally does resolve. So you can see that as these abilities trigger, more abilities might continue to trigger, and those keep nesting and nesting. And the basic rule is whenever you have a nested ability, you have to resolve that and put everything else on hold until you've resolved that ability. The only catch is that you have to finish resolving whatever ability you currently are resolving. Just to make that last part really clear, that Death Trooper's ability, which deals 2 damage to a friendly unit and 2 damage to an enemy unit, is a single ability. When we resolve that ability, if we were to deal 2 damage to our friendly unit with an on-defeat trigger and 2 damage to an enemy unit with an on-defeat trigger, we don't stop in the middle to resolve the one on our side. We have to finish the ability entirely. Then we have 2 on-defeat triggers that happened at the exact same time. We go back to our previous timing rules, and as the player of the action, we will choose which on-defeat ability is nested now and resolves first. We would actually have simultaneous nested abilities in that case, which starts to get pretty interesting, but we just follow our normal rules for resolving abilities and it's all good. Once all nested abilities have resolved, then we're going to step back. We're going to go back to the larger doll and we'll start resolving anything that was pending at the same time. So in this case, if that Death Trooper is still in play, we get to resolve its ambush ability finally. Now, we could do things a little differently, and in these situations, we're going to come up with a nested action instead. Let's say we played that Death Trooper with Energy Conversion Lab, but instead we choose to resolve the ambush ability first, before the Death Trooper's damage ability. That ambush ability allows us to perform an attack with our Death Trooper, and an attack is an action. That means this is our first example of a nested action. Nested actions are honestly pretty similar to nested abilities, but the catch is that when you're performing an action, you sometimes have various steps, various checkpoints where triggers are going to happen, and we basically completely resolve that action as if it were our action phase, resolving all triggers at the appropriate time, while keeping everything else on hold until that action has fully resolved. So in the case of the Death Trooper, when we resolve that ambush ability, he doesn't have any on-attack ability, so at least that one's not too complicated, but he will go ahead and perform the attack. The simultaneous damage from the attack will be dealt to the defending unit, and from the defender back to the Death Trooper. And then any on-defeat abilities will trigger on any units in play that were dealt damage from that attack. Once that attack sequence has fully resolved, whether or not the Death Trooper is still in play, its ability still triggered and was put on hold while we resolved the nested action. That means we're going to go back and resolve that when played ability now to the best of our ability, deal 2 damage to a friendly unit if we still have one in play, and 2 damage to an enemy unit. Note that when a unit leaves play, its triggered abilities that already triggered will still resolve, again, to the best of their ability. But if it's something like an ambush trigger and the unit is no longer in play to ambush, then you obviously cannot resolve that action. Now, nested actions can actually take some other different forms that get a little more interesting as well. Let's take a look at the light side for this one. We're going to look at Rebel Assault. Rebel Assault is a card that allows you to perform an attack with a rebel unit and then perform another attack with a rebel unit. Now, when we're resolving this single ability, it's going to perform 2 attacks. That means it's actually going to have within itself 2 nested actions. And as usual, when we do nested actions, all other abilities go on hold until we resolve each action in sequence. So in this case, you'll perform 1 attack. Let's say you perform an attack with Sabine Wren. She performs her attack, she uses her on attack trigger, she might trigger something on defeat. All that stuff will get done, and then when her attack has fully resolved, then we go and resolve the second attack from the Rebel Assault. The key, again, to nested actions and nested abilities is you fully resolve whatever is nested, and then continue on with whatever was left pending. The Comprehensive Rules has another similar example to this, also using Sabine Wren, but this time it's talking about playing Sabine Wren with Energy Conversion Lab and with the card Fighters for Freedom in play. Fighters for Freedom, of course, has an ability that triggers whenever you play an aggression unit, and when you use Energy Conversion Lab to play Sabine, when she is played, she is also going to be able to perform that attack. Now again, these are 2 abilities with the same timing. When you play an aggression unit and when played have the exact same timing, so the player playing Sabine with the Energy Conversion Lab will get to make the choice about whether they want to resolve the Fighters for Freedom damage or they want to resolve the ambush from Sabine Wren first. If they choose to resolve the ambush from Sabine Wren, they will fully resolve Sabine's attack while that Fighters for Freedom ping is still pending. As soon as they finish resolving the ambush, they'll go back and resolve the ping from Fighters for Freedom. Now let's talk about one more card involving nested actions, and this is one that is getting a lot of play right now and involves a totally different type of nested action, which is going to be playing cards. That's U-Wing Reinforcement. U-Wing Reinforcement will allow you to play several units right out of the top 10 cards of your deck. And just like any other nested action, each unit you choose to play is going to become nested and resolve sequentially when you play them. The really easy example for this is if you play U-Wing Reinforcement and you find 3 Vanguard Aces. Now, Vanguard Ace has a when played ability that says it gets an experience counter for each card played before it this turn. When you play the U-Wing Reinforcements, that's going to go in your discard pile and you resolve the effect. And if you find those Vanguard Aces, then you are going to create 3 nested actions where each one is going to be an individual card play. You resolve them sequentially, so the first Vanguard Ace play will resolve, and its when played ability as part of the nested action of playing a card will immediately resolve, and it will get 1 experience counter from having played the U-Wing Reinforcements. Then the second Vanguard Ace will be played, and its when played ability will resolve. When its when played ability resolves as a part of resolving that nested play action, it will see that 2 cards were played this turn, the previous Vanguard Ace and the U-Wing Reinforcement, so it will get 2 experience counters. And similarly, the third one will then get played as the third and final nested action within that U-Wing Reinforcements, and then you will get 3 experience counters on that card, 1 each for the 2 previous Vanguard Aces and 1 for the U-Wing Reinforcements. Now, I know I just talked a lot and it might be as clear as Dagobah's swamps to you, but let's just briefly recap the types of nested abilities and actions we went over. So nested abilities are going to happen whenever an ability is triggered as a result of another ability. When this happens, you put everything else on pause and resolve the new nested ability, and if that were to cause another nested ability to trigger as it's resolving, then you would resolve that new nested ability before you head back to the top of the chart and resolve the things that were still pending and waiting to resolve. Keep in mind that with abilities, you never interrupt an ability to resolve another one. You finish the current ability and then you will resolve any nested abilities that are waiting to resolve. And after resolving those nested abilities, you go back to the top to the previously put on hold abilities and resolve all of those. Now, for nested actions, it is just slightly different because actions have multiple steps to them, and sometimes triggers will happen in the middle of performing actions, such as on attack, when this unit completes attack, on defeat, when played, and you are always going to resolve those at the appropriate timing. When you have a nested action, resolve that action as if you were taking that action normally, but you just have those pending abilities that may be waiting to resolve until your nested action completes itself. If you have questions about those, go check out our examples again, maybe walk through them, put out the cards yourself and see if you understand. And if you still have questions, feel free to drop down in the comments below. I'm happy to provide comprehensive rule citations or just general answers to your very, very specific questions. It is very fun for me to sit down and test my rules knowledge and help explain these rules to everybody. I think I've done a good job so far of getting everything right, but I am super happy to take on any challenges you might have for me in the comments. I hope you found this a helpful video explaining nested abilities and nested actions. Again, this is probably the most complicated part of Star Wars Unlimited, but if you got through this and have a good understanding of what I'm talking about, I think you can tackle pretty much any game you come across and come up with the correct answers. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Thank you so much for watching another installment of our sort of Star Wars Unlimited rules lecture series. I do hope these are super helpful for everyone, and very soon we're going to start actually getting to things like deck profiles, and we're going to have some Twin Suns designer interview stuff coming. I have a lot more fun Star Wars Unlimited stuff on the way, but I felt it was important to get this rules information out to everybody, and based on your comments, it seems like a lot of people have appreciated that. So really appreciate you all watching this. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much, and we will see you guys in the next one.